I remember as a child growing up and going on a family vacation and going to a drive-through zoo. Ever heard of a drive-through zoo? One of those deals where you get into a cage in your car. You get in your car and then you drive into a cage with all kinds of wild animals. Have you ever? Anybody else done that? Am I the only one? Okay, a few of us. And you drive in and they tell you, now keep your windows rolled up, right? And don't stick your hands or your arms outside. And then as you approach the gate, they give you a bucket of food, which requires you to roll down the windows and stick your hands and your arms outside. And we were on vacation, Kimberly and Ann and I, last summer, and we were up around Port Clinton, Ohio, and I saw this billboard for a drive-through safari, and I thought, I got to do this. This, brought back childhood memories, and I want Ann and I have those memories. And Kimberly, can you believe it? She had never been through a drive-through zoo, and so I wanted to take them, and we went up to this place in Port Clinton, and we get into the van, and Kimberly and Ann are sitting on the front seat, and we drive through the entrance into this cage with all these animals. And at first it's fun and nice and pretty, and have these little African deer run up, and this little alpacas come up, and they stick their little heads in the window, and you feed them, and giraffes, they lean their big heads down and put their long tongue into the cup, and isn't this neat, isn't this wonderful? And then we came around to a little herd of buffalo. Man, I didn't realize how big buffalo are. I mean, we're in a minivan, and it was looking at me eye level. This thing was huge. And the biggest buffalo in the herd of buffalo decided that he had an itch, and he decided that our minivan was a perfect scratching post. I have it from our home video. Watch this. Here, you'll see the buffalo coming up, and he gets an itch.
Oh my gosh.
And Anna's like, oh my gosh, he's going to scratch our car.
He's going to scratch our car.
Look at that thing. It's huge. That just irritated him when I honked the horn. So he goes over here, and he actually lifts the van. You can't see it, but the van is being lifted up right now. This thing is, look at that thing.
Oh my gosh, he was
At some point, Kimberly's like, Chad, do something. What am I going to do? Beat it with our umbrella? I honk the horn, and it gets off. And now if you go out into, Kimberly is already at the first service, but you can go and see our minivan, and to this day it has this big scratch from where that buffalo was scratching its itch on our car. And every time I see that scratch, I think to myself, what in the world was I doing in a cage with a buffalo? What was I doing there? And today that's the question I want to ask you. What are you doing there? What are you doing in a cage with a wild animal? Because I can guarantee you this, the animal with which you live in that cage will do more than scratch the hood of your car. It will do something deep inside of you that leaves a wound that will feel like it will never heal. And maybe you're sitting there saying, what in the world are you talking about? Nobody lives in a cage with a wild animal. That's just crazy. I mean, you're the stupid one who drove into a cage with a wild animal. No, none of us would live there. And you're right. Nobody in their right mind would live in a cage with a wild animal. And yet people all the time get locked into a cage with lifelong fear. It would be interesting to try to figure out how much we do that is driven by fear. And how much of what we avoid or do not do is because of our fear. So afraid of failing that we refuse to try. So afraid of being hurt again that we refuse to try and love again. So afraid of losing what we have that we hold on so tightly that we squeeze the life out of what we have. So afraid of the unknown that we choose to stay with the familiar even though in the familiar we're miserable and we hurt. And with fear the size of buffalo, we live our short lives only free to experience the limited grace and the limited joy and the limited blessing that our little cages will allow us to enjoy. Now, nobody in their right mind would live in a cage with a wild animal, but we live in a cage with lifelong shame and false guilt. Others mistreated you. Others abused you. Others took advantage of you. Others did awful things to you, and yet for some reason you feel ashamed and they don't. Shame says to you, you should have known better. Shame says you were just asking for it. Shame says, if you were a better person, that never would have happened to you. It's a lie, but it sure doesn't feel like a lie. Or someone in your life makes a poor decision. And now they're experiencing negative consequences because of those poor decisions. And instead of him or her feeling the consequences and the pain of those consequences, you feel it. And you live it. And you say, if only I had, if only I could have, oh, I really should have. What? They made the decision. It's the negative consequences from their decision. Why are you feeling guilt for it? That's false guilt. And you know that, and you tell yourself that, and other people who love you tell you that that's not real guilt, that's not yours to carry, and yet that's how real false guilt can be experienced. Now, nobody in their right mind would drive into and live with a wild animal in a cage, but we don't think twice about living in a cage with lifelong emotional pain. Abandonment, loss, rejection, betrayal, disappointment, ridicule, worthlessness. Whatever you call it, it hurts. And time heals nothing. If time does anything, it makes hurt all the more. Do you like the pain? Of course not. So then why don't you just get over it? Why don't you just move on like everybody says you ought to? Because the reality is you don't have a choice. Right now you're in a cage with a wild animal and you don't have the key to even get out. Nobody would deliberately live with a wild animal in a cage. And yet all of us, I'm sure at one time or another, I'm sure all of us in some degree or another, even now, find ourselves captivated, prisoner of habits of sin. And we relate to Romans chapter 7 where the Apostle Paul is incredibly honest and he says, I know the good I ought to do and I do the very thing I shouldn't do. And I can't stop it. I can't even help it, Paul says. And we identify with that. And we promise our loved ones, I won't ever lose my temper like that again. And we do. I won't ever withdraw from you, honey. I won't ever withdraw from you like that again. And then weeks and months go by and we're just completely withdrawn. I won't gossip like that anymore. No, I won't drink again. I mean, I know what it does to me. I won't go on the internet and look at that pornography again. I'm not going to do this stuff anymore. And what we find is we get so focused on the behavior that we don't even realize that the behavior isn't really the problem. It's the why behind the behavior that has locked us into a cage with a wild animal. And the Apostle Paul encountered a whole church of people at the church of Galatia who were being persuaded to live inside a cage. For them, it was encaged with the religious law. That was their wild animal. We would call it today legalism. It's where they were being tempted to focus so much on outward appearance and so much on outward performance that they forgot about what really matters is internal transformation. And he said, dress this way, talk this way, act this way, hang out with other people who dress and talk and act this way, and you're in. And Paul says the only thing you're going to be in is in a cage, is in a prison cell. And in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, at the end of that verse, it's on the back of your bulletin, Paul says, do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Do not let yourselves be burdened again. Do not let yourselves be weighted down or held back or chained up anymore. Paul says, don't live like that. Get out of there. Walk free from this stuff. And together with all the Galatians, I'm sure, we say to the Apostle Paul, if only it were so easy. Paul, do you think that we want to live in this prison? Do you think we want to experience this bondage every day? Do you think we want to be held back and burdened and weighted down? Don't you think we want to experience the real joy and peace and love that God has for us? Paul, if we knew the way out, don't you think we would take it? And Paul says, good. I think if Paul was here, he'd say, good, I'm glad you're challenging me. I'm glad you're pushing back on me. Because maybe that means you're ready for this great truth. And this truth is for you and me every bit as much as it was for his original audience. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, it says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. That is a truth to stand upon. That's a promise to stand on. Would you stand with me and let's read this out loud together and let it sink in a little more. Let's read it out loud together. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Now on the next slide, I had them take out us and put a blank line so you could put your first name there. So in instance, in just a moment, we'll read this together, but I would read it as this. It is for freedom that Christ has set Chad free. Just fill in your own name as we read this all together. It is for freedom that Christ has set Chad free. Thank you. You may be seated. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Let that sink in. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free.